Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 50 Years of Project Tiger Conservation Conflict Critique online symposium. We're very happy to have you with us to discuss and analyze this conservation program that's sparked a lot of debate and a discussion in the past. This is a collaboration between the Indian Animal Studies Collective and the Sheffield Animal Studies Research Center. Our symposium is set to unfold over 3 days, December 1st, 8th, and the 15th, and with about 6 panels. We are honored to present a group of very distinguished scholars, each sharing their ongoing research on this interesting topic. I'm Susan Harris from IIT Delhi, and the co-organizers of this symposium, Anu Pande from EFLU Hyderabad, and Dominic from the University of Sheffield will tell you more about the conference and about themselves after my brief comments. I just want to offer a very brief introduction to Project Tiger and highlight collective concerns and just speak about what makes this conservation initiative so captivating, because Project Tiger continues to be talked about as a model for large-scale wildlife conservation initiatives and has contributed to shaping policies for the protection of endangered species globally. I want to restate some of the facts that most of us may know about Project Tiger so that when we listen to today's speakers and later on, we can think about Project Tiger critically, but also with an open mind. It was launched in 1973 in India when Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister, and its main aim was to safeguard the endangered Bengal tiger and their dwindling natural habitats so that they don't become extinct. And it was certainly initiated in response to the alarming decline in the tiger population. And the key features of the Project Tiger were that the project identified the creation of designated tiger reserves across the country to provide protected areas for the tigers to thrive. And these reserves were chosen to ensure the conservation of viable tiger populations in their natural habitats. And it was also aimed at preserving their ecosystems. So the slogan was that save the tiger and you save the habitat. And there were also very strict anti-poaching measures. So these included strict patrolling and just a lot more monitoring and surveillance by the forest departments. But many of these features, as we know, were very problematic, such as community involvement, which was less about recognizing the importance of the contribution of local indigenous communities in conservation efforts and more about displacement, relocation, and rehabilitation. So I want us to think about what it is about this project that attracts so much criticism in academia. Why is it controversial? Why is it considered a failure, despite all the goodwill that it had in the beginning? So is it really because it harms the human, or because it could not really protect the tiger, or both? Why would it be problematic to talk about Project Tiger as a method of care? In the title of the talk, it says Poetics and Politics of Projects. And I use the word poetics because there is something very human, and of course, very anthropocentric, but very human, bureaucratic, and logical about the way the project as a planned endeavor with fixed budget, resources, and goals brought people, institutions, and the nation together. Even when I was in school, which year was the Project Tiger started? Which state is this tiger reserve situated in? These were all regular questions at all the quiz competitions. So this interests me greatly, where in post-colonial India, the animal question seems to enter the public consciousness in a distinctly human way as this huge, ambitious project, but I also want to suggest as in some poetic way. So the poetics of Project Tiger is that it casts this majestic tiger as both a charismatic flagship species and a cultural icon deeply ingrained in India's collective consciousness. So the tiger becomes a metaphor for the beauty of the wilderness and nature. And through its imagery, Project Tiger was seen as a project directly derived from a sense of national pride and responsibility towards the country's natural heritage. And the very name Project Tiger conveys a sense of urgency, framing the conservation effort as a noble endeavor to save, a symbol of strength and grace. And in this way, the tiger, this apex predator, the preservation of this very real animal becomes an ecological imperative and cultural responsibility. Not so much for the people who live with these tigers, but for people who live far away. It becomes important for scientific discourses and environmental narratives as the number one example of what government interventions could look like. For example, elephants are a cultural symbol in Kerala, but in Wayanad, people see them really as very troublesome animals. So like all the post-independence mega projects, in a way, there seems to be a curious divide between this poetic aspect of Project Tiger and the practice, where the implementation of Project Tiger does not seem to benefit either the tigers or the local populations. The tiger seems to become a floating signifier where they're abstracted from their environments and seems to become all body and aesthetic. And we know that there is a similar dissonance in the management of other species identified and valued for their charisma, such as elephants. But why exactly does this happen? Is it because the poetics of the tiger as a symbol of national pride had to contend with the practical politics of governance, budget allocations, and economic development? So it appears that this poetic idea of rescuing the tiger from extinction is in a way compromised from the start by some sort of reality of various socioeconomic realities which weren't foreseen or accounted for. So even today, a decline in the tiger population in a particular area can cause that region to become devalued. My friend Akashdeep, who I can see is here, he does field work in the forests in North Bengal, and he says that animals there don't get enough attention because there are no tigers there. He argues that Indian wildlife tourism and conservation is tiger-centered. Forest officials of a tiger reserve get extra pay than other national parks or wildlife sanctuaries where there are no tigers. So then the problem many people say is that the tiger is privileged as the sole object of conservation and the interventionist model it undertakes, which is top down and indifferent to the local reality or the local marginalized peoples. But since we're the Indian Animal Studies Collective and the Sheffield Animal Research Studies Center, we also want to really think about this question of the tiger, the real animal behind it. And because the project has contributed significantly to the recovery of tiger populations in some areas. And there has been instances of successful habitat preservation. So it doesn't seem like, even though it may be possible to say that, yes, the reality is that it's not implemented efficiently, the project, or that the project is not a very efficient project. I want us to think about whether the idea itself may have some value in relation to what it's trying to do. So in the panels of the conference, many of these issues will get discussed and debated, but I really don't want us to try to adopt the neutral stance which we may have to adopt while writing research papers, or by being in a particular area and by analyzing what reality is while talking to local populations or people. But I want us to try to resolve some of these dilemmas and think about the tigers themselves, not simply as some poetic idea, but as very real animals. And that's all I wanted to say. I will now invite either Anu or Dominic to introduce themselves and tell us about the conference.
Thanks, Susan, for such a rich opening statement, sort of mission statement of our own. I think that my role today will be quite sort of housekeeping-y, administrative. I'll be chairing the panel. So before I get to those details, maybe I can invite Anu to introduce herself.
Thank you, Dominic. And good afternoon, good evening, or just simple hello to everybody, depending upon where you are on the globe right now. My name is Anu Pande. I teach German literature and cultural history at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad, and have an interest in animal studies. I guess that goes without saying to explain why I'm here. In my courses at work, we try to go behind what various animals do in literary texts and what is done to them, and look at the, so to speak, the making of animals historically, to understand the roles that animals seem to play in literary and cultural production. In other words, we try to peek behind animals as metaphors or symbols and unravel and endeavor to unravel them as material semiotic knots. Knots that are entangled with socioeconomic factors, often political decisions and visions which are market-driven, and larger processes in the multi-species human-animal studies, human-animal conflict marred arena of the Anthropocene. It was this interest, in fact, that brought Susan and I together to co-found the Indian Animal Studies Collective a couple of years, in which we endeavor to talk to people, to experts, scholars who've written about the animal, mostly in the context of India, of post-colonial India, but also from otherwise. And it has been a rich and very rewarding journey. That's in fact how we also got to meet Dominic, virtually that is, and discuss his work with him. And when he approached us with the idea of organizing a symposium on 50 years of Project Tiger, we couldn't have been happier, because the moment seemed just right to do this, because there is so much in the news right now that one reads, and reads critically as well. And so what better way to broaden our horizons, to learn more, than by organizing the best in the field to come and talk to us about their work. In the Indian context, of course, the tiger occupies a special position, as Susan also mentioned in her introductory remarks right now. Right from the tiger as the national animal of India to the Project Tiger and 50 years of it now, the tiger as material semiotic knot invites an unraveling as well. And I'm very excited and very, very happy that we will be joined in this very ambitious endeavor by all the wonderful scholars and experts who have graciously agreed to be a part of this symposium and share their expertise and thoughts with us. I look forward very much to learning and unlearning in the course of our 6 sessions over the next 3 weeks, and welcome you all to this conference. Over to you, Dominic.
Oh, thank you, Anu. So, I mean, one of the contexts, of course, in the UK is that we have a increasing public consciousness about endangerment and extinction, but this anniversary date has kind of had no registration here. And one of my motivations for organising this symposium also was to be able to speak in a way to people in the West, or in the UK at least, if I was to be a bit less ambitious, to try and actually bring this issue to the forefront here. And I'm so, just want to reiterate and echo the praise and happiness that we feel, because I reached out to a lot of people who did not know who I was, cold emailing people and really asking them to do something that they, you put your trust in me and your faith in me, and you said yes. And so I'm really, really happy and looking forward to discussions over the next 3 Fridays. So as I said, my role is going to be a chair today, a little bit more administrative. And as you'll see from the Zoom situation so far, we have some people on video, and we will have other people on video. But I think for the majority of this talk, as well as for the other talks that we have coming up, we're going to be having kind of the chat closed, cameras off, microphones muted, just so that our speakers can really focus on their own presentations. In the Q&A, we will, of course, open it out. And I think it's important here to mention that we have Anu, Susan, and I manning, in a sense, the Zoom, but we also have Sam Hind, who's from Sheffield. And Sam is, as you've seen from emails, is the conference assistant. If you'd like, give us a wave, Sam. Hi. And so between us, we should be able to keep track of everything, admit people. And of course, if anything does go wrong, I hope you'll forgive us. The technology is it will always be what it is, and we'll just try our best. And hopefully by the final Friday, we might have ironed out any kinks, but hopefully there are none at all. So without further ado, let me turn to who we're going to be hearing from today, and just talk about a little bit of the structure. So we're first going to be hearing from Revati Pandya, and then after that it'll be followed by a response from Sudha Vassan. And it gives me real great pleasure to introduce both Revati and Sudha. Revati is going to be speaking for about half an hour. Sudha is invited to respond in any way that she wants, that feels appropriate, that feels generative, and then we'll open out for wider questions. So now I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers today. So Revati Pandya is a researcher and a practitioner in the field of feminist political ecology in India. She's currently a faculty member in the School of Development at Azim Premji University. And so Revati studied in St. Xavier's College in Ahmedabad, University of Peace in Costa Rica, and before pursuing doctoral research on the political ecology of ecotourism in Corbett Tiger Reserve at Wageningen in the Netherlands. Revati's published very widely on conservation, with particular insights into community dynamics, ecotourism, neoliberal environmentality, the Western Ghats, land use change, and the Forest Rights Act. And these have appeared in journals such as Conservation Society and Environment and Planning E. Today, Revati will be presenting a paper titled Socio-Cultural Considerations for the tiger tourism market, of Corbett Tiger Reserve. And Revati's respondent today will be Sudha Vassan. Sudha is a professor of sociology at the University of Delhi, and she teaches and she writes on political ecology with a real special focus on issues that pertain to gender, to caste, class, as well as advocacy issues, and how they intersect with development, ecology, and environmentalism. She's got a regional interest in the Himalaya, and she's got publications that consider social, cultural, economic, and ecological changes, cross-border trade, sacred nature, gender, and natural resources, among many other things. Sudha is the author of Living with Diversity, Forestry Institutions in the Western Himalaya, which was published in 2007 by the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla. So we're going to be hearing first from Revati and then Sudha. Thank you so much, guys. Take it away.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen. Yeah, is this visible to everyone? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this interdisciplinary gathering and symposium. It's really nice to be part of this also because I have an interdisciplinary background in psychology and then political ecology. So I'm looking forward to all the discussions. And so my background beyond that is also just working largely with organizations in India on forest resource rights in the context of protected areas since about 2011. So today my talk is focused on local engagement with ecotourism at Corbett Tiger Reserve, and I foreground local people's lived experiences and their identity-based positionalities in relation to Tiger Reserve governance, using an intersectional feminist political ecology lens. So, and this talk is based on my doctoral research. And I'll first provide a critical perspective on the Tiger Reserve and tourism and center two dimensions of gender and forest villagers to really just throw light on the inequities and also discuss ways of better conservation governance, if at all, in this framework of a tiger tourism and tiger reserve governance model. So Tiger, Corbett Tiger Reserve is located in Uttarakhand, and as Susan said, Project Tiger was inaugurated in 1973 in Corbett National Park, so making this one of the first 9 tiger reserves in India. And as we know, tiger reserves are managed largely through a core and a buffer area model. So core areas are in violet spaces and no human activities allowed except for tourism, safaris in certain zones. And buffer area is a multiple use zone. So there is human habitation and other livelihood activities. And the one that's promoted the most is ecotourism, even in this area. So Corbett is also home to the highest number of tigers within a defined wildlife protection area in India based on the last tiger census. And this substantial tiger population has propelled tourism promotion by the state, resulting in a booming industry shaped both by state forestry agency and private enterprise. So as a result, there is a mix of ecotourism and blurring of ecotourism and sort of mass tourism enterprises in this context. But the overlaps most often are still using the narrative of ecotourism in the form of safari, facilitating safari bookings at the least, if not more. And so my research is largely based on the southern villages in the south and southeastern boundary of the reserve, because that is where there is the highest density of villages plus tourism enterprises as well. And so just a little overview background, the areas surrounding Corbett are a combination of rural and forest landscapes. So historically, livelihood activities in this region were largely subsistent agriculture, livestock keeping, and forest resource use. And soon after it was designated a tiger reserve, the villages that existed within the demarcated boundaries were displaced and moved outside to areas controlled by the state forest department. So the villages are now distinguished by 2 formal classifications: revenue villages and forest villages. Revenue villages are agricultural areas within definitive cadastral boundaries of private land ownership. And these villages fall within the jurisdiction of the district administration and state revenue department. So that's a very different kind of lived experience from forest villages, which are located within areas that come under the land ownership of the forest department. And so individuals and households in these forest villages cannot obtain titles to own land or set up permanent structures and houses. And access to basic resources like education, opportunities for forest villagers to continue to survive, in a sense, are limited and are shaped by also their engagement with tourism even more than those who live on land with secure land rights. So just looking back, this tiger reserve has a strong preservationist history because this was also a site for a hunting area before it was designated as a national park, the first national park of India and the first one in mainland India, Asia in 1936. So during the colonial regime, and it is named after Jim Corbett, an officer of the colonial regime who was known for being a hunter turned conservationist and who spent years in the sub-Himalayan region before he left India. So in that sense, the resource management history as well of Corbett is rooted in coloniality, preservationist ideas of wildlife conservation, and creation of exclusive spaces for tourism or elite uses in the form of hunting as well. So this is the broader context where tourism was introduced in the history of dispossession, but also a fences and fines model, and thus creating a lot of dependencies. Some would argue they've been successful, some not. And state support for subsistence agriculture or livestock keeping livelihood activities is limited, particularly in relation to wildlife incursion in farms or loss of livestock that has been preyed on. So that in itself has limited or defined or guided people in a different direction, and that is largely tourism-based work because of the dominance of this market in this area. And a focus on ecotourism or even just tiger tourism in a sense, or tiger reserve tourism is very significant because of its reliance on the park management via the income that is generated through the safaris, and of course the overall promotion of wildlife conservation, which is used globally, right, for any sort of conservation movement or conservation agenda. Ecotourism or any form of visitation or appealing to certain tendencies of care are also promoted. And in this context, tourism and safaris is one of the primary ones. And in the last data collected from 2016 and 17, the Corbett Reserve earned about over 93 crore rupees from the safaris in that 1 year. And this is close to about $1 million US. And so it's, in that sense, it's possible because there's a lot of safaris going in. So there are like 7 safari gates at Corbett with 2 safaris per day and 30 jeeps allowed per safaris. So that's a significant number of people going in, and also significant number of significant type of activities taking place within the reserve boundaries also. And as you can imagine, because of that, the market outside the reserve boundaries has really proliferated. The image on the right is a screenshot from Corbett Tiger Reserve official website. So there are these different types of safaris, and of course, there's overnight stays also taking place, and promotion of local culture and wildlife in a sense, which largely wildlife through the museums that exist there. And these are often part of packages that the hotels or resorts book. So you have this kind of promotion again tied into the hotel narratives and marketing as well. So because safaris constitute the primary form of ecotourism promotion, in that sense, the blurring of mass tourism in terms of what kind of enterprises are set up plus ecotourism is often takes place as well. And it's also an important factor because tourism was initially also known or used as a way of arguing for Project Tiger, and as also a means of promoting awareness about nature and wildlife. And again, this is common in many or all contexts around the world for protected areas. So in Corbett, Officially, the ecotourism was formally introduced by the Forest Department in the 1990s in the form of guide training. So safaris needed guides, and because the Forest Department lacked manpower, it was the local villagers who were called on to take part in this training and therefore become guides. And this was beginning of a sort of a win-win-win ecotourism discourse of wildlife conservation, awareness building, and local community involvement. Following this, in 2012 as well, the National Tiger Conservation Authority officially promoted ecotourism, asserting that it has the potential to enhance public awareness, education, and providing nature-compatible local livelihoods. So then NTC also envisions ecotourism for incentivizing local people for protecting forests and wildlife. So through these various safari zones, the kind of markets or enterprises that have emerged around are safari booking agencies, hotels, tea and food shacks, restaurants, resorts, homestays, and tour agencies as well. For more context, there are even more ecotourism guidelines that have been consolidated and added, where the discourse is kind of a win-win discourse, and particularly speaking about forest dwellers' rights has been also promoted by the NTCA. And this kind of narratives about participatory community tourism strategy, or ensuring benefit and income to local communities, forest dwellers to control and maintain their resources, rights, and cultures as well. So this is also a stark difference, of course, from a lot of realities that we see in tiger reserves and what's unfolding in the context as well. So this kind of promotion has come under a lot of critique around the world, specifically looking at it from a neoliberal agenda of using monetary incentives to enable conservation work. And in addition, in most such cases, research also shows that there is rarely, if at all, long-term community-based benefit or self-sustenance for the people. So the question that follows through here and kind of surrounding this research is also who is used for conservation labor and who benefits. And as we know that no community is homogeneous, so even within a village context, on what basis are benefits and losses distributed as well? So even if there is well-intended ecotourism initiatives and locally owned or managed, what is the difference in terms of identities that actually defines the rights, access, or local benefits that we talk about or we see so much of? So the socio-economic landscape around the villages close to the south and southeastern boundary of Corbett are influenced by these sorts of establishments. And these are some of the smaller ones, of course. There are larger resorts from global chains, hotel and resort chains also, and very elite and expensive accommodations as well. And more increasingly, there are homestays as well. So there's a mix now taking place. And since the early 2000s specifically, there has been a lot of booming of the tourism market. And there are close to about 100 such establishments of all sizes and varieties around this south and southeastern boundary. And there could be more now in the recent past as well. So most of these claim to be ecotourism based because, as I said, they do offer either things like village walks or bird watching, and of course facilitate safari booking as well. And a lot of them claim to employ or support local communities in the form of employment, or it could be often just wage work as well. So again, there is like this variegated distribution of what work within tourism also means for the people, and of course how it is promoted by these establishments. And the landscape continues to change. For instance, this signboard here promoting land sales, and many villagers, specifically revenue villagers who own land, have sold their agricultural land either completely or partially and have moved out of this area as well, either to nearby cities or to further down in the plains. So what's happened is those who trained first as guide training initiative worked as a Corbett guides at the designated safari gates or with few private entities, hotels, or wildlife enthusiasts who had regular international tourist clientele. And having gained this experience, these guides have set up their own safari and travel agencies. So in the sense, they are some of the known guides in the area, and they're all local people from revenue villages. And many men have also sought livelihoods in tourism in their own or neighboring villages, as opposed to migrating out of the state to work, which is believed to be a positive step in the overall livelihood trends of the region, because historically there has been a lot of out migration taking place because of lack of government support on any other form of livelihood activity. So in a sense, there's also this larger, broader context of historical livelihood work that has been ignored, and tourism on top of that has kind of made it much more of a dependency-based model as well. But there are benefits, as I said, many people do see it better because people are living in the village as opposed to out migrating. So as you can see in these images, there's also a lot of, this is just a broader context where in the bottom left image, you can see construction taking place. And this was while I was doing research. A villager had sold their land and agricultural land. So they are in the process of getting some form of a hotel built here. And surrounding in the backdrop, you can see the forest, and surrounding this area is agricultural land as well. So even in terms of the landscape dominance, it is quite a stark image because there are hotels right next to agricultural lands, and that also creates its own set of issues in the day-to-day, whether or not you're directly involved in tourism. So in general, authorities, and as we saw, the NTCA also cites such prominent employment avenues or inclusion of local people as guides or safari jeep drivers as a beneficial ecotourism initiative. And a significant group of local villagers are also involved in jobs such as cleaners, gardeners, or watchmen. And so the local in this case is also largely exclusive to those of the privileged identity of caste, class, and gender, in terms of those who have more regular jobs or more steady jobs relative, like being a guide or a safari jeep driver, or someone who's employed in the managerial position of a hotel, which is very rare, but that does take place. So men have jobs such as ownership of shops as well, or small enterprises. So gender roles in general in this region for livelihood have been divided based on resource and agricultural based work that is primarily carried out by women, and the market-based economy work, which is carried out by men. So traditional livelihood practices involve collecting firewood, fodder from the forest. And over time, of course, these practices have changed, as in many such contexts, because of the shifting forest management regimes and restrictions to accessing the forest, in addition to desire for mobility or moving out of the forest areas and modernity for many as well. So although this shift is taking place, there is also shifts in kind of tourism promotion where women are now have been invited to be part as safaris in terms of safari jeep drivers. So there very recently in 2020, women were trained to become jeep drivers. And this may be a superficial move or it may be beneficial, we don't know yet, but based on very recent, my interview with the recent guide, they said that even though women are involved, there are many other guides who are not really treating them as equals. And so in a sense, without addressing any other underlying socio-cultural patriarchy, these women may not really have sustainable future in this line of work. In that sense. So it may also further disincentivize more women from joining if this continues. So in general, material opportunities through the economy are different for men and women. And accessing market-based work is easier for men than for women due to the structurally set avenues. And other forms of tourism work that women are involved in include shopkeeping or standing in for their husbands for temporary periods, or managing the shop completely. And occasionally, some women also work in hotels and resorts, performing jobs like gardening, cleaning, or labor. And in the administration or finance department, rarely. And the nature of this work, again, is defined by the socioeconomic standing of caste and class positioning, and therefore largely are from revenue villages as well. Those who already own a certain, families own a certain amount of capital. So for instance, this is the instance from Sheila's life story, and she lives in a revenue village but does not own land. So she said that I helped build that hotel, and I would walk up 2 or 3 floors with a load on my head, and no one now speaks of who built that hotel. So it was 2 or 3 of us women and some men who were the labor. And now she works in another enterprise that is more ecotourism based and prefers it because it's involves more inside work rather than outside work. So in a sense, this, even like Sheila does not own farmland and works in others' farms, a situation again brought about from her account of being scheduled caste status and as a result of the landlessness that she experiences. And so she works as farm labor when needed, and she also cares for her cow, but like others, difficulty in accessing the forest more and more so. So for Sheila, access to opportunity in tourism for most of her life has also been shaped by the caste structure. And despite the shift that she experiences in her daily lived experience of inside work being better, there is no real mobility in her life in that sense, in terms of land holding or ownership that comes with this. And similarly, this is an instance from Tanu, who mentioned that there have been a lot of changes taking place in the village for many people, and of course the landscape changing, but it's not making much of a difference for people like her, because Tanu is, again, does not own farmland and has been working as farm labor. And so a lot of her work has been influenced by tourism in a sense. And she's also part of a women's self-help group. And they had this collaborative idea of owning a tent house and then renting it out to other hotels and resorts in the village to be able to gain some income as a group. And so in that sense, it's again defined, like even what they're doing in terms of tourism, not tourism, is influenced through these activities, because neither Tanu nor her husband are directly associated with tourism, yet it has affected their access to other work opportunities in a sense, and also dependence on a new income option. So this tourism has not meant in any way for Tanu, in a sense, a shift again in the ability to own land, or a shift in even accessing such rights of land ownership, despite being of a relatively privileged class than Sheila. So again, these are instances that have some of the very few of the many instances that I'm highlighting here. And the second dimension that I want to go over is the marginalization of forest villages, which has been also written about significantly in critiques of tiger reserves in India. And the focus on, again, these villages is important because they also constitute a significant amount of labor for tourism initiatives, by and large. And daily work such as washing dishes is most common in forest villages, followed by work for local businesses or government infrastructure projects like building roads or fences around the reserve as well. So a village elder from this forest village stated this stark difference in their access to the forest, saying they keep taking the tourists inside the forest and tell us to keep quiet, and safari jeeps go in, but there's no issue of so many people going in. The issue is always with us going in, and better jobs always go with people with contacts. So there is this very direct relationship also within this forest village, where people with contacts, in a sense, the few who have more privilege in terms of class or caste, have been able to access outside resources through building social capital, and to be able to find better tourism-based work as well. So in that sense, this is very different from a revenue villager who owns land, because they have more flexibility in what they do with the land, despite the negative impacts of dependency on tourism as well. So there have been, in the interest of time, I will wrap this up now, but so there have been a lot of calls for inclusion of social culture, social sciences, and rights of local people in conservation governance. And a lot of people in this panel are part of building that and have been writing about that for decades now. And with regards to Project Tiger as well, there have been efforts to and promotion and research showing that you need to relook at this exclusive conservation agenda. So in a sense, I want to conclude by reflecting on what equitable conservation in such a context would look like. And one of the primary points would be to address the landlessness and recognition of rights for the disenfranchised. And these considerations are based on the fact that local identity difference has huge implications on questions of what participation or benefits, access is, especially when the NTCA guidelines also say that forest dwellers' rights and culture should be recognized. And also, I draw this from work that I've engaged with convivial conservation framework to examine how and why conservation, even if it is a progressive conservation policy, needs to attend to the local identity difference and its intersecting power dynamics. So one factor is to foreground women's work and their role in the rural and forest and tourism context as well. So while forest dwellers are at least mentioned in the NTCA guidelines, women are completely ignored as well. And this is fairly common in a lot of so-called development, community-oriented language also. So the steps towards including women in ecotourism and training in terms of training for safari jeep drivers is there, but without really addressing root issues of rights or alienation from people's land and livelihood, or even patriarchal relations, and the prolonged inaccurate narrative of win-win ecotourism is affecting the ability to even think about sort of a just conservation space. And the other point is about considering and thinking about how can we support Forest Rights Act in this context, particularly when forest dwellers are to be involved in controlling and maintaining their resources as the NTCA guideline states. So in that sense, there is also a need for forest dwellers to be consulted in and if and how ecotourism really should continue and the involvement in the same, because this can likely mean that many will opt out of tourism work given a choice, especially when their rights are recognized. So to find equitable pathways in a sense should be done in consultation with the people who are most affected by conservation measures, in order to also see how it can be more adaptable to different contexts, and should also be based on equity in terms of identity-based positionalities. And this is also something that needs to be further discussed and further seen how it would play out, like I said, in this context with the people who are living here. And not to say that there won't be other local power dynamics taking place, but that's something that I look forward to in the discussion. And I will conclude here and thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. I hope I made the time.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. And as you can see, people are giving their clap reacts. So thank you for a wonderful presentation that kicks us off. So many brilliant avenues for us to go down straight away. And doing that, I'm sure, will be Sudha, who I'll pass over to now.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Thank you, Dominic, Anu, Susan, for inviting me. As I said in the mail, I think you've got everyone who's been thinking on this issue out here in your symposium. and people are going to do the thinking for the next few decades as well. So it's lovely to be part of this. Thank you, Revati, for that wonderful paper. I think you set up many of the main issues that we'll probably need to discuss through the symposium and even otherwise as well, right? Because you've set up the issue of social inequality, the whole issue of Project Tiger and its history, the prehistory as well as the 50 years history that the symposium wants to look at. You've set up the idea of conservation labor, the objectives, the overall social structure, whether it's patriarchy or other inequalities. So I think you've touched on several axes. What I'll try and do in maybe 5 to 7 minutes is really pick up on some of the larger points, yeah? And then I did have a chance to read your paper last night, Revati, but we can come back to the specifics later if there's time. I wanted to begin, in fact, with what Susan had said about the poetics and the politics as being two important ideas when we look at conservation projects. And I wanted to add to what you said, Susan, that it's not only that the tiger has been charismatic, but I think the Project Tiger itself has been possibly one of the most charismatic conservation projects, both in India as well as globally, the kind of global attention it has attracted, as well as at the local level. So, in fact, I think a lot of the literature even moved from talking about national parks as a theme to Project Tiger or tiger reserves as a theme. So, in fact, what you say about the tiger as an animal, because you're interested in animal studies, because I look at social practices, I find a lot of the descriptions you had of the tiger are also true of Project Tiger. It has been majestic, it has been dramatic, it's been powerful, and it's been a metaphor, right? So, in some sense, the criticism of Project Tiger, then that you mentioned that there's a lot of it, is also because it's a metaphorical critique of a group of practices that often span perhaps beyond Project Tiger. In fact, Project Tiger itself, it seems, in the 50 years has changed and learned and evolved. So I want to state that right off, that when there's a critique of this, it's not simply a critique of a particular project, but the kind of tendencies that have moved, that have changed as well and improved and, gotten worse in some ways. That is one set of things that I think came up in Revati's paper as well, where she spoke about the history of how this is a region which always had that, not always, but had a fortress conservation history that seamlessly moved into Project Tiger as well. Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to bring to the discussion is that we often talk about this history now. Almost everybody here is aware that we need to look at conservation history that way. But I wonder if we bring it enough when we look at the local, right? So in Revati's paper as well, Revati, I would love to hear more about how local people perceive or what memories or narratives they have about this history, rather than of just Project Tiger. For instance, Corbett, in the little that I know in that whole Uttarakhand region, is a household name for people who do not speak English as well, right? So in that sense, it'd be interesting to hear a different history or the same history from a different perspective of how Corbett is perceived. One, the older people have narratives about Corbett and his tiger hunting, which are not always only about the restrictions imposed on them, but also of a particular relationship to the forest and to the tiger. Yeah. So that is where I wanted to come back to poetics and politics that Susan mentioned. I think very often we pick up on the poetics of conservationists or people like us who are often middle class, and we have a poetic, who have a poetic attachment to the tiger or to nature. And then when we think of politics, we go to the poor local people who are displaced and say, let's look at their economics and politics. I wonder if it's worth our while to twist that, right? And that's part of where the critique, not the criticism, comes from. That more and more, I think, work is looking at the poetics from the perspective of people who live with these animals. So, for instance, Revati, I'd love to hear how people in those forest villages perceive or have a sense of when the tiger may attack, may not attack, the stories that they have. So the stories that people have of the forest department and conservation laws that might restrict them are often interwoven with narratives about the animal itself, right? Some of the literature also does this, but most often you hear. So some of that, I think, would again enrich your paper, where you bring the poetics to people who are living with the, they are, of course, worried about their economy and the displacement and all of that. But the reality is they are living with the tiger much more than any of us or even the forest officers do. So that poetics and politics reversal is one that I'll really, the animal studies group as well, it'd be wonderful if you guys comment on it or what you think about it. The second kind of, okay, the second one I've already mentioned, the whole idea of history. I think right now in the literature, we are aware of this history of conservation. There's a fair bit written about it, but there's only little bit that's been written on uh, a local sense of that history. So, and Corbett perhaps is a lovely place to do that, Revti, because of the stories about Corbett himself, but also subsequent to that, the kind of things that have changed there. The third kind of thing that I really liked in Reti's paper, I think one of the points she's making is that we often think of the local as a category, as a box. And I think Reti's fieldwork brings out very clearly that it's not, a clean box that you can deal with. It's actually a very messy kind of society with hierarchies and inequalities and patriarchy and caste and all of that. So that really needs to come up more when we think of conservation and local involvement. And that is where the challenge comes up, because there's already at one level the larger politics of displacement, but within that the social structure itself. But there I was curious, Revti, that you didn't mention who are the people, who are actually the people there, and what is the culture. You're right in the sense that the inequalities and the local culture needs to be taken into account, because are you really studying the one Gujar? If there is, then that particular group as a nomadic pastoralist community and a culture that goes with it. And when you think of history, I think a decade-long movement in that region of the One Gujars that went on, right? The struggle, it was in media. I mean, I know some of you here, that in fact was when I was middle-aged, so some of you might have read that only as history, but really even in the 80s, right? The One Gujars were, in one sense, an important part of the protest. So I was wondering about that culture of people who live in the Corbett, but also the fact that they were nomadic pastoralists. So when you think of ecotourism, it's often place located, right? Your tourists will go to one specific place. So really, in that context, I was wondering whether it's worth talking about what culture do we really want to display or recognize? Do we want to recognize or display cultures which are not stable, that don't believe in sort of sedentarization, that have been sedentarized through a historical process? And if so, how would we even do it? Right? So when we say ecotourism and tourists within one place, we're already reducing culture to some kind of artifacts. Right? So it's worth thinking about what culture is for ecotourism, and given what culture is generally or more broadly in terms of people's lives and ways of living. And there, of course, issues of power. Who decides what culture is worth displaying? I can't, I mean, maybe I'm incorrect, but I can't think of an ecotourism project across India which would want to display hunting. Although hunting is such an integral part of cultures, many cultures and indigenous cultures. So that kind of, I'm not suggesting that we display that, but I'm saying recognizing that there's power in the way culture gets defined itself in an ecotourism, in any kind of ecotourism project. It's a part of the requirement. The other couple of points that I wanted to emphasize again, also because I think it's of broader interest in your concept as well, the idea of tendencies of care, right, that are often associated with ecotourism. That again, I think it's interesting, because what we're trying to do with the idea of ecotourism itself is a marriage between tendencies of care and consumption. And I think there are inherent contradictions in trying to bring the two together. Right? Having said that, I mean, that doesn't mean I'm rejecting it as an idea, but I think we need to focus more on the inherent contradiction between paying for and therefore caring for whatever it is, nature or people or whatever, that there might, there's an inherent contradiction in that is worth sort of thinking through when we think of conservation. The fifth is the idea of conservation labor. As I said, in fact, Revti's paper touched on so many of these axes that I'm just throwing them up or highlighting them. Conservation labor, again, is something that has become something that people, including people here, have been writing about. And again, Revti, I was sort of curious about the specificities of when you talk about employment, right? What kind of incomes are we talking for employment? Because one of the things that's important to look at is that when we go in with projects, both conservation and development projects, we often think of the payment for labor or the incomes based on what people used to earn earlier. So these are, of course, the poorest of the poor. So we therefore think a minimum wage or less than that is a great opportunity that we are providing to people. But again, Revti, I'd like your comments on this. Often people are not looking to the past and thinking, oh, wow, I used to be poor, I didn't have enough to eat, and now I'm eating enough. People look to the future, right? So the aspirations of people is where we need to pitch perhaps the incomes when we think of conservation labor, which we often don't. I think Jared was part of your list of either speakers or discussants. The whole idea that forest watchers, a large number of people are actually on contract labor. I don't know how it is in ecotourism, Revti, in your site, that these are really very precarious jobs, if you just think of them as jobs. So these are not something that people want to do in the future or their children to do. Of course, it might be better than the past given the history of the region. So that idea of conservation labor, I think it's worth connecting with labor studies and looking at struggles over incomes and aspirations of workers. And perhaps if we want to think of sustainable conservation, then the amount spent on actual reimbursement or even actual employment of people, we really need to think of the quantum of that as well, right? We often don't think of how much people are actually being paid when they're employed, even as guides and things like that, and what kind of permanent or social security is provided to, for instance, the conservation, the guides who go on safari and things like that. Revti made a very good point on the win-win narrative that's often, sort of prevents us from seeing the other aspects of it. Again, going back to Susan, this is not necessarily a criticism. It's simply that there seems to be a hubris in the win-win narrative. Perhaps it's coming from optimism, where we want to see these as possible, but perhaps a critical optimism is more helpful, because in the win-win narrative, what happens is that there seems to be a huge arrogance that by giving women jobs, patriarchy in that entire society would somehow be challenged. That kind of narrative, perhaps it's the project mode and the project writing mode that needs to show very strong wins. I would rather go for small things that we're managing to change by going in to do conservation, and that actually helps us build better rather than very large claims. And that is one, I think, Revti pointed out, that the discourse or the narrative of win-win itself contains within it a kind of arrogance or hubris that, in fact, is counterproductive. A couple of other things, perhaps. The last one, maybe I'll stop with this. I think an important point that Revti ended with, the idea of land and who owns land. I think there's a larger feminist literature on women and land as well. And one of the things I was thinking of when I was listening to kind of what Revti was saying on, how women actually struggle with these traditional roles and have some possibilities within ecotourism, was really the larger literature even on development and compensation and how that has changed. Within just development, even World Bank now talks about things like giving land in names of women, right? Or compensation to women's accounts. So that is something that conservation, in fact, could learn from as a kind of way to move in this direction of looking at least at gender justice, if not other aspects of it. So thank you so much. I'll stop there. I sort of found this very, very interesting. Thank you, Revati, for making me think of all these points. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Dominic. To you.
Thank you, sir. That's absolutely wonderful. The sharpness in which you've picked up on all the key points, the generosity of critique that you've offered, an amazing way for us to kick off our discussion. I will immediately, of course, throw it over to Revati for comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Sudha. That was indeed very rich comments and feedback. And I might have to ask you to repeat a few points in case I missed something out. But yeah, this could take days, conversation about this. But to start with, in terms of what of the tiger and what also history of Corbett in that sense, so a lot of it in the areas that I was doing research in the villages has been fairly common to what we know, what we keep reading about in terms of critical literature, which is where the forest villagers are largely critical in terms of even more bitter for obvious reasons, because there has been restriction, and that restriction to the forest is much more real and everyday, even more so than for for revenue villagers, even if the women are not allowed to go into the forest to collect firewood, because of the landlessness and inaccess to education, to other job opportunities as well, therefore, and tied to that a lot of other forms of inaccess as well. So and the forest villagers, at least in the villages that I was looking at, and the two that I was focusing on mainly, that's also where there have been human wildlife conflict in terms of at least a couple of people in each of the forest village who live to tell that they have been attacked by a tiger, and the critique is from their perspective is less so that the tiger attacked me, but okay, so if we need to relocate, and if some of us want to relocate, can you give us a chance to do that at our own will and at our own choice, but where we want to relocate? And for the rest, it is also a matter of, there is, of course, even more protection for the tiger, but where is the protection for us? So it is a fairly kind of a in-your-face distinction that most of these forest villagers were talking about. In terms of stories about Corbett, I imagine you meant also Jim Corbett in terms of the context, like poetics. So in a lot of these villages, it's not as prominent. For them, it's more about living next to this tiger reserve, and of course, historically moving from the hills down to this area. Even some of them before the tiger reserve was designated, and some subsequently over the years. So a lot of the villages have settled there from that, for that reason, to access more infrastructure and work and education as well. So again, tourism in that sense fits in really automatically. Of course, even the people know that it's very precarious, and there is critical perspectives towards tourism from the villages. So it's not just me talking about it or us discussing it. People know that, but there are dependencies because there is an everyday, day-to-day reality as well. So it is a messy, in a sense, situation, and that would be a very interesting research thread to continue in as well. Of course, there is a village called Choti Haldwani that's a little further away from these research villages, which is where Corbett was based. And their stories about Corbett are very highly kind of spoken about, and also the fact that he set up this village, which he did. He did get a group of people to live there on the land that he owned. And then eventually people were renting from him, and then eventually he let go of that land. So in that sense, there is a very different socio-cultural dynamic there, and they're all landowners. And it's a small village, and it's very almost like overthrown with homestays and ecotourism in that particular village. So there's almost this overburden of that happening. So any house you go to, they will have some story about Corbett, about like, oh, how like he gave my grandfather this gun, and then we gave it to the museum that's here in this village. So that's the difference in a way. And yeah, in that sense, the poetics even of the tiger, there's less so that, but in these villages, there's more about just being close to a forest and dependence of the dependencies with the forest, but not so romanticized, at least in the current generations, as perhaps the older generation, where they were very happy with what they were doing. And so a lot of the older generation I spoke to, they said they don't really understand this tourism-based work, but it is something because our sons can live in the village without out-migrating. So it is that, but at the same time, for forest villagers, despite of being here for so long, we don't have rights. And we've seen the resorts come up, and we've seen the reserve management getting more and more restrictive, but there hasn't been much changes for us. So there is that kind of difference, but also to that extent of poetics that I was able to induct from the research. And so also local sense of history in that sense, as I said, comes a lot with the need and desire to also access infrastructure, because most of them have settled here historically for that, because it's closer to the plains region. And it's something that I did in my larger research, but didn't really go in here. But the fact that Uttarakhand state is also such a new state, it was only formed in 2000, and it's been fairly unstable in terms of giving people employment or other sort of livelihood, benefits, or even security in a sense. So right now, in terms of tourism, right now, Uttarakhand state government is also promoting and giving subsidies to people throughout the state to set up homestays. So you can use apply for the subsidy and use the income to, make a new room or kind of renovate your house. So right now, the state is really focusing and running on tourism. It can be ecotourism is the main thing in terms of nature-based tourism, because also the access to the Himalayas, which has been historical, not new, but also a lot of religious tourism. So all these come together. And a lot of tourists who come here are part of the trail often. So that's the sort of history. And also, the Van Gujars, yes, they have a very, historically, they have been fighting for the rights, and very messy and disappointing relationship with the forest department, because even during the research, I know that there were houses that were being broken down by JCBs, by the forest department within the forest. And so, yes, their kind of access to market and tourism is completely, market is to the extent of making milk-based sweets, because they are pastoralists. So they make, they have livestock, of course, limiting more and more, but they sell the cream that comes from the milk to the nearby town. So that's the main form of subsistence right now. And so they continue to fight for the rights. And I mean, as we know, a lot of people here also, as you know, as you said, are involved in supporting that, and through organizations and the Forest Rights Act. So, but in these villages in the south and southeastern boundary that I was looking at, there was no Van Gujjar in that sense living there in the forest villages, at least. And yes, and there is a tendency of care in ecotourism very strong, and it is something that I think people ride on, the market rides on, of course, resorts ride on, and the tourists also feel that there is something good that came by their visit there also, a lot of the tourists, right? Because it's clubbed with the feeling of being in nature, but also doing something good because we are supporting the local community for those who live in resorts that claim certain types of benefits. and certain donations go to a local school. But care to the extent of also, I mean, like what the contradiction again is, who is caring for the forest and why? And of course, this goes back to the win-win criticism and consumption. So for the local people, for a lot of the villagers that I've spoken to, they also embody the care when it's needed, when they have to engage with tourists. So they know they're part of a market, they know they have a business to run or be part of a business. So it's not something that is done very naively as well, because you have to be strategic if you need to be surviving in this. So yeah, you will use those narratives, even if they don't necessarily always believe in them. And that's something that we know about very long. I mean, it's ongoing research in tourism and communities that there is this embodied self that you promote, and then there's your own genuine self also, right? So a lot of those care narratives, and that would be actually a very interesting area to just focus on and see how those narratives are really unpacking here. And yeah, and the point about conservation labor, yes, it's something that does need to be looked on more, especially in this context, in terms of the quantifiable measures, as you said, right? Like the incomes and in relationship of the aspirations, as you said. And I largely looked at or considered aspirations in terms of why people are engaging with forms of tourism, despite knowing very well that it is precarious and it is a dependency-based model. But aspirationally, it is also something that is more present and available here in this context. So that's part of, I mean, it doesn't address your main question, but that's part of the thoughts that right now I have, and I can see Dominic's message. Yeah, okay. So we have, yeah.
No, obviously, I hate to interrupt. It's an amazing back and forth. And of course, we can carry on the conversation across the conference. And yeah, I want to give you the chance, obviously, to respond and develop your thoughts. But equally, I want to be able to hear from other people who I'm sure have had thoughts floating around their head as the session's gone on. So I think that everyone should be able to do the raise hand function. And if anyone does have a question, what I would like to do, seeing as we are running out of time, is maybe take 2 or 3 questions at once. So maybe we go to 1, 2, or 3 of you to pose a question, and then we'll throw that back, and Revati can respond however she wants to, and then we'll close the session from there. So please do raise your hands if you have questions. Great. So I can see that Ambika already has a question. Anyone else? Well, I'll go to her while we're waiting. Let me just. And Mahesh. Great. I just need to be able to. Can somebody please allow Ambika to unmute herself, and then we can get going.
Yeah, you should be able to unmute yourselves now. I've changed that.
Okay. Hi, Revati, and thank you so much for your wonderful paper. I teach sociology of tourism here in IIT Gandhinagar, so I was able to sort of relate to what you're talking about ecotourism in the context of the larger tourist project, whether eco or not eco. So I was in any touristic project, there is an element of authenticity about culture. When tourists go and visit some place, they want to see the authentic culture, whether it is a dance form or whether it is But what tourism does is to package in such a way to make it more original and more authentic. So there is this concept of staged authenticity, because tourists are aiming, they're paying lots of money to look at tigers or wilderness. So I like the idea of staging something. The idea of national park itself can be seen as a staging of something, staging of this untouched wilderness. The idea of wilderness is so much ingrained in the concept of conservation. And so I was wondering, are there different levels of staging here? One is the landscape itself. The Corbett itself is staged in such a way that the idea of wilderness should be out there for the touristic consumption of no villages inside, no people inside except animals, and tourists will come and see that. And also connecting that to the conservation labor that you're talking about. There is labor invested in maintaining. That's why I'm using the word staging the wilderness concept. But is that also, when people talk about tigers, as you said, they speak about tigers in different ways. There may be genuine ethics of care, but because of tourism, because of this consumptive nature of tourists, do you think there is staging of ethics of care here? So I'm interested in that paradox of course, these national parks are very important, but there is also an element of, because the nature of tourism itself is paradoxical. As Sudha was saying, that there is conservation, but there is also consumption in a very capitalist investment. So the idea of capital and nature itself is an oxymoron here. So I'm just requesting you to, if you have some thoughts about the idea of staging something. In this case, you're talking about staging of nature in specific way, the national park model, and also staging a certain element of staging our concerns about caring for nature. Is that also shared? Because if you don't do that, then tourists, because you want tourists to come in, right? So there is a certain way of talking about nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambika. Ravati, before you respond, I also would like to go to Mahesh as well. And then you can address both at once, however you would like to. Mahesh, I think you can unmute.
Thank you. Two related questions. Corbett initially was named the Haley Park, and after independence, it was renamed the Ram Ganga. And then around little after Jim Corbett's death, it was renamed the Corbett Park. It's rather unusual that in independent India, site or place was renamed after an Englishman. So I really think it's very interesting you touched on Choti Haldwani and his memory. So Corbett became, in a sense, a part of memory in these foothills, and perhaps the renaming of the park refers to that. Perhaps unintended, because Corbett at no stage advocated the kind of preservation we are seeing today. But I had a very simple one-line question on ecotourism. Just as, the renaming of the park was unintended, Corbett never imagined probably that there would be the renaming of this park. Do you think there are unintended consequences of ecotourism, for instance, in local consciousness? And if so, what could they possibly be? Because you have done very detailed in such. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mahesh. Over to you, Ravati.
I'll first start with Ambika's question. Thank you, Ambika. Yes, I agree and I completely relate to what you mentioned about the staging and stage authenticity. So yes, as I was also responding to Sudha's question, so there is that staging of ethics of care for sure by people who are living there and who are involved in forms of tourism. And this is largely the people who are either guides or the jeep drivers and that is staged when you are on the safari or when you are dealing with them or negotiating with them in terms of the timing or just meeting them at a different time outside the safari, outside the reserve. But a lot of them outside this space of their job don't really show any particular ethics of care in terms of the same questions, especially when I was asking about their ideas about the park for some of them, or what it means to them. So whereas inside the park, it was all about this grandiose idea about conservation of tigers, but also other wildlife. So for most of these people, it's not just tiger. They are actively pushing for tourists to look at other wildlife as well. Even though the tiger does become the main part of the show, and building up the show, especially in safaris, is quite a thing to experience. And I think Nitin here was there when we had gone on a safari. And the way that they build it up and show this ethics of care or stage it is also very grandiose. It's like, oh, we hear some rustling, oh, there's a jeep that stopped, and there's walkie-talkie talking conversations happening, saying that, oh, maybe we've seen that, so let's reverse the jeep, and there's a back and forth, and there'll be jeeps crossing by and tourists asking each other, like, did you see a tiger? And the guides discussing, have you seen something? Or we saw some tail going past there, so you might want to go that way. So there's a lot of these, and it is, a lot of it is staged. And this is not something that I'm saying just from what I saw or my idea, but people have, like, a couple of the guides also told me that some of them have to do it because some tourists are, it's not just ecotourism as in itself, right? That the tourists also make ecotourism as good or bad as it is, because tourists then blame the guides or jeep drivers for not being able to see a tiger, or for them not showing a tiger. So they do have to really kind of have this stage their role as the facilitators of giving the people what they want, and most often they're not. So also sometimes their tips are based on whether they see a big mammal or tiger, of course. So there's a lot of this sort of staged ethics of care in a sense, and also over promoting this specific activity in that moment, and hyping it because there's high energy, there's tension, and this is not just, everyone feels it. Even I felt it, because everyone was, despite knowing that a lot of it may not be true, there's this group energy that suddenly comes in. So in that sense, there's a lot of staging also happening. But the other bit of staging is, a lot of it is happening now with homestays, but it's much less, because that's really about, a lot of it is like, oh, this is our culture, this is what we eat and talk about, and this is how we live. And that is also very common to a lot of other homestay contexts that we see. And I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to move on to Mahesh's question. So I'm not sure, Mahesh, if I understood or am I taking your question correctly, but so for the people, the unintended consequences of ecotourism is, in a sense, this being tied without meaning to or wanting to this model, to this market. I think could be framed as one unintended consequences, because it's not necessarily that they want to. But I think for a lot of people, especially entrepreneurs who are setting up their own businesses, the local people, the stakes are higher. So it has become, in a sense, the only form of available non-land-based work or non-agricultural based work that is present. So it does render, in that sense, and in a way, an unintended consequence. But I'm happy to be corrected if I did not get your question correctly. And I'm also aware of the time, so I'm just trying to be short right now.
Thank you.
Great. Well, so we, as you know, we are having another session in a couple of hours' time, and one unfortunate thing that's happened is that Nayanika Mathur has had some personal circumstances this morning, so she can't make it this afternoon or this evening for those in India. But what that means is that we'll have more time to have a discussion in our second session of the day. So I just want to really thank our questioners, Ambika and Mahesh, to thank Sudha for a quite thrilling response, and to Revati for a really brilliant paper. Thank you to Susan and Anu for some great thoughts to kick us off. And as I say, so we'll be joining again later. It will be the same Zoom link, and it will be the same setup. So we have Sonakshi Srivastava talking first with a response from Ambika Ayadurai. So wonderful for you to all join us, and I'll see you later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.